Great. If you want to turn then in your Bibles again to Mark chapter 13. There's a sense of out with the old as we come to a new year, and indeed as we come to this passage. Out with the old is what we're thinking about, and it's quite strange actually. I spend a bit of time on Twitter and Facebook and social media and that kind of thing, but I've seen very few New Year resolutions this year. It's quite a strange thing. Now, when a few people, of course, like to have a dry January, but when the Prime Minister announced another lockdown, more than one person on my timeline said, "No, that's dry January out of the way," which I kind of understand. In truth, I think life is so uncertain generally that it's very difficult to say, right, this year I'm going to do this, that and the other. Or I'm even going to use this lockdown to do something. With so much uncertainty around, people seem to be reluctant to make those plans. Chapter 13, though, is very much about this idea of out with the old and in with the new. That there is a definite changing of the guard sense about chapter 13 that we'll certainly come to. But it's on a massive scale, not just a sort of local individual, I'm going to do this differently. There is something enormously changing that's happening here in Mark chapter 13. We're actually going to read about some pretty awful things. But we're also going to think about how it relates to you and is in fact very, very good news. But we start with really quite an uncomfortable and painful thought, that simply that judgment is awful. It's absolutely awful. So what we're going to do is we'll get a grip of chapter 13 overall with a fairly quick relatively quick run through of quite a lot of verses. So if I read the first 4 verses again to get our bearings. As Jesus was leaving the temple that day, one of the disciples said, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the walls." Jesus replied, "Yes, look at these great buildings. But they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across the valley from the temple. Peter, James, John and Andrew came to him privately and asked him, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled?" Now, this is chapter 13. Chapter 11, go back a couple of chapters. That started on Palm Sunday with Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. It was a magnificent thing. Then what we had in chapters 11 and 12 was 2 chapters of people questioning Jesus. They were challenging his authority, trying to trap him and trick him with their questions and words. And he answered them in ways that were actually very helpful and positive, not just simply escaping from the trap, but helping people along the way. Now, in turn, when he finished that, he asked them a question back, and that question itself was very, very helpful. And should have pointed them to think about who Jesus really is. Son of David, Son of God. That's the conclusion they should have come to. But they completely missed it. They weren't interested. So now he's left the temple courts. Having spent 2 chapters and all these discussions and stuff about the temple, now he's left the temple. He's walked out, never to return. And on the way out, the disciples draw attention to these magnificent buildings and absolutely tremendous, huge, spectacular things. And Jesus says, "Yes, okay, but you know what? It's going to be completely demolished." And so he goes east, across the valley to the Mount of Olives. And in verse 4, they ask him, "Well, when? When's it going to be demolished? When's all this stuff going to happen?" Now, this is Mark's Gospel. If you go to Matthew 24, and you can read it as the same discussion going on, Matthew frames the question from the disciples in a slightly different way. So Matthew 24, the disciples are recorded as saying this: "Tell us, when will all this happen?" Same question. "What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" Slightly different question. And in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus absolutely addresses those 2 questions. When is the temple going to be destroyed? When will Jesus return? Because the Bible's absolutely clear. Jesus is going to return at the end of the age, at the end of the world. And you and I need to be ready for that. What a day. Here in Mark, though, that the question is limited. It's only that they only really ask him about the end of the temple. And the reason I sort of labour that and point that out is because people will read chapter 13 in a number of different ways. And you may hear sermons, you might read books and have slight variations on it. And the reason for that is it is actually quite complicated in a few ways. But as I see it, whereas Matthew's emphasis is very much on the two elements of the end of the temple and the end of the age, most of chapter 13 is around the end of the temple, because it's not that the end of the age isn't actually part of their question. But next week Jesus does come to that at the end of the chapter, and we'll see that next week. So verse 4 is kind of what steers our interpretation, our understanding. Verse 4, tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled? That is, the end of the temple. That's the context in Mark's Gospel. And Jesus' answer, first off, he actually gives them a warning and tells them to watch out for a few things. Verses 5 to 8, he says, look, you're going to hear people claiming to be the Messiah. And you'll hear of wars and threats of wars and all that kind of stuff, earthquakes and famines, and all that's going to happen, but the temple will still stand. You'll hear about all this stuff, but the temple will still be there. Then, verses 9 to 13, he warns them of trouble that's going to come to them personally. Remember, he's speaking to these four men in private, to Peter, James, John and Andrew. Peter, we know, will stand trial. You can read through Acts and you see what happens to these fellas. Peter stands trial. James ends up being killed in prison on Herod's orders. John ends up in prison, in exile on the Isle of Patmos. So these things are absolutely going to come to them in their lifetime. John in particular would live long enough to see the end of the temple in AD 70. But their trouble, all of the trouble that comes to them personally, was not the sign of the end of the temple. Yeah, so even as bad as things are going to get for them personally, the temple will still stand. That's what Jesus is saying. But then in verse 14, he gives them what will actually be the sign. So verse 14, the day is coming when you will see the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing where he should not be. Reader, pay attention. Then, at that point, you need to run. You need to scarper, flee the city, get out. What's the sacrilegious object that causes desecration? That's a mouthful, isn't it? It's not 100% clear what that object was, though there were a number of candidates. Between AD 68 and AD 70, there were a number of horrendous things that would have been repugnant to Jews right there in the temple. Statues of the Roman Caesar and all sorts of things. It's there are a number of things that it could have been. And so certainly when you see any of those things, Jesus is saying it's time to flee. That means that we've really hit rock bottom. And what actually happened was AD 70, at the time of the Passover, when Jerusalem was packed with Jews that had come from all over the country, that they'd all descend on the city, and there would be more Jews in one place at the time of the Passover than at any other time in the year. And that was the time where the Romans decided to invade. And they went on the rampage. It was horrendous. Savage, brutal, indiscriminate, men, women, children, just brutally murdered as they tried to escape. Even Roman soldiers got killed in the crush and in the mayhem. And the eyewitness accounts are absolutely sickening. And I'm not going to read any of that to you. It was just horrendous. The city was completely sacked, and the temple was destroyed, flattened, not one stone left on another, completely destroyed, as Jesus said it would be. The Romans had had enough of the Jews, and they were out to wipe them out. That was the plan. But of course they weren't wiped out. Why weren't they wiped out? Why didn't the Romans manage to completely flatten the whole lot? Well, verse 20 gives us a clue. In fact, unless the Lord shortens that time of calamity, not a single person will survive. But for the sake of his chosen ones, he's shortened those days. Chosen ones, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Elsewhere in the New Testament, that means Christians. Yeah, there are Christians in the city, and for the sake of them, the city wasn't flattened completely. Not everyone was killed. So that's the sign of the end of the temple. Now, Jesus then warns them against more false prophets in verses 21, 23. And then he uses some Old Testament phrases to describe what's going to happen. And they're quite powerful words that he's using for us. So let me find. So he speaks about. Let me get that reading back up. So I've lost the reading there. Let me. So verse 26. Then everyone will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great power and glory. And he will send out his angels to gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven. You see, those are really strong words. The Bible's very clear. Jesus is in heaven now and will return to the earth in the future. But then verse 30, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene before all these things take place. Heaven and earth will disappear, but my words will never disappear. You see, it's tremendously powerful what Jesus is saying. Jesus is in heaven. He will return to the earth in the future, but things he's talking about here, he's saying are going to be in the lifetime of the generation that he's talking to, which is really quite a key thing for us to grasp in terms of timing for what all of these things are saying. The NLT's version of verse 29 isn't particularly helpful because it talks about his return, whereas the original actually just says it. So that as they've translated that into English, it's not been entirely helpful and might put us off path a little bit. So where it says his return in verse 29, it's better just to read it. And verse 26 that talks about the Son of Man coming in that way, that's actually a reference to Daniel 7. And his... as you read Daniel 7, that is actually about Jesus' ascension into glory, into heaven, where all power and authority of all nations has been given to him. And so Jesus now has all power and authority to rule and reign over the whole earth, not just over the Middle East. So for all that, right now you're sort of reading that and you think, okay, it's ancient history though, isn't it? It's ancient history. Why are you telling us this stuff? Because frankly, it just doesn't seem relevant. It's awful that those things happened, but what does that mean for us? Well, let's come back to our text. Mark has really good news for you. And this is where we really want to grasp what's going on, and why Mark has spent so much time on this stuff about the temple. And so what we need to do is grasp these two massive truths going on in chapter 13. Things that matter to you, things that matter to me, things that matter to us all. And we'll get there shortly as we come to these two huge things. First, we need to think about what the temple actually represents. So back in Eden, the sort of top box there, you've got Adam and Eve, and they're walking with God. They're in his presence. They can see his face. They walk. Everything's perfect. They're with God in all his perfection. They see him. They walk with him on the earth. It's a beautiful, astonishing truth. But they chose to sin, as we know. And what happened? They were barred from Eden. They were thrown out, and a gate was put in place, and there were flaming torches, and they could not enter. They absolutely could not go back into Eden. They were excluded from God's presence. That's what was lost at that point. To be in God's presence is the highest, loveliest experience that anyone can ever have or enjoy, and they've lost it. It's gone. So now all of humanity is excluded from Eden, from the presence of God. Now, later when God called the Israelites to be a nation, we're coming into the sort of second box now, in Exodus chapter 19, he gave them instructions for a tabernacle, a temple tent. And when that was made, we're told that the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. It was an astonishing moment. Exodus 40 there. They'd built this thing, and suddenly God himself is, of course God is everywhere, but a particular sense of his presence came and dwelt there, and they couldn't go in. They could not enter this tabernacle. The heart of the tabernacle is what's known as the most holy place, where God's presence would dwell, and he would then be dwelling among his people. So it's kind of a mini Garden of Eden right there in the middle of a sinful nation. But who can go in? Who can go through that flaming gate? Well, there was just a curtain, and only the high priest could enter. Only the high priest could enter this miniature, mobile Garden of Eden and God's presence. And even the high priest could only go once a year on the Day of Atonement. Years later, that tabernacle, that mobile temple, was replaced by Solomon's magnificent stone temple, stone and wood and splendour and gold, and an astonishing thing in Jerusalem. And that replaced the tabernacle. And again, what happened when that was established? The glory of God filled the temple, and it was an incredible, spectacular moment, because God's presence was there. God was present among his people. But what happened? Well, they sinned, didn't they? They had that limited access to God, but they sinned. They rebelled, they chose other gods, and over God warned them. He sent prophet after prophet, and over they rejected prophet after prophet. And in the end, Israel were exiled from the land, thousands of them taken to Babylon. Among those exiles taken to Babylon was a man called Ezekiel. He had been training to be a priest, and just at the age where he might have entered the priesthood, he was exiled off to Babylon. And then, while in Babylon, he then actually prophesied the end of the temple. He was never going to be a priest. He became this prophet of God. And while he was out there, he had this shocking, absolutely shocking image, a vision, Ezekiel chapter 10 and 11. The glory of God that was in the temple, his vision was of it leaving the temple. And it moved from the most holy place into the outer court of the temple, across the valley, and settled on the mountain to the east of Jerusalem. God had left the temple, an unthinkable moment, and he would abandon that temple to be destroyed by the Babylonians. That was God's judgment on the people. Now Jesus spent time in the temple courts. The temple was later rebuilt. Jesus spent time in the temple courts, and people tested him and tricked him, and he pointed them to the scriptures that explained who he is as Son of God, Son of David. And what happened? They rejected him over and over. So the Son of God left the temple. He stopped at the mountain to the east, the Mount of Olives. God had left the temple again, and it would soon be destroyed again, not by the Babylonians, but by the Romans. It's God's judgment. And judgment is terrible. So why is that good news? Well, Mark's been building up to this all the way through his gospel. It's quite a tremendous central truth for him that is easy for us to grasp until we start asking questions. Why has all this text been given over to the temple? Now, you remember that Mark's gospel is sort of written in three parts. Part 1 is all about Jesus' identity. What was he doing in the first part of Mark's Gospel? He was forgiving sins, he was raising dead, he was calming the storm, he was doing things that only God can do. This is God who has come to the earth. In the middle of that section actually is a sermon, one sermon on, you can see it in chapter 4, and it's about where he gives the parable of the sower, explaining that yes, there is tremendous good news, but most people will reject it. And so he was setting expectation there that although there is kingdom growth, most people will reject it, even in this context of God having come to the earth. Part 2, that's his journey then from the north down to Jerusalem. It's all about what it means to follow Jesus, the journey to the cross, and en route you see the transfiguration, the glory that he is going to. But his lesson over and over, the repeated lesson, is a call to serve others, because even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And it's at the cross that he does that, even to death. And part 3, the bit that we're in now, it's about the new way to come to God, that the old, out with the old, in with the new, is what we're seeing here. And the old is the temple, and the new is the cross. That's what's going on here. And that's why chapter 13 is so focused on the temple. In fact, what we've seen in chapters 11 and 12, it all happened in and around the temple. Now we're hearing about the end of the temple. And then we come to the crucifixion, and it's at that point we need to give a spoiler, actually. Adam and Eve's gate to Eden was closed off to them, of course. They couldn't go through that gate. Later, God did dwell among his people in the tabernacle, in the temple, but only the high priest could enter Eden, as it were, the holy place where God was. Only he could go through the curtain into the most holy place. But as in Ezekiel's day, the temple of Jesus' day would also be destroyed. But if the temple's destroyed, how can you approach God? If that's where God dwells, how can you approach him? Well, that's where we get our spoiler text. So we jump forward to Mark 15. At the moment Jesus dies on the cross, at that moment, Mark chooses to refer to the temple again. Can't you just focus on Jesus at the cross? No, because you need to grasp what's going on. So chapter 15, verse 37. Then Jesus uttered another loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the Roman officer who stood facing him saw how he died, he exclaimed, "This man truly was the Son of God." I said earlier, there are two massive things going on. The first is that God is bringing condemnation and rejection on the people of Israel. Why? Because they had rejected God over and over. Now they've rejected his Son, even to the point of putting him on a brutal Roman cross. They are condemned for what they have done. Rejection of the Son brings condemnation. There's your first big thing. And yet, the second big thing is that the old covenant then is over. Out with the old. Jesus has opened up a new and living way. You don't need to go in through flaming torches at Eden. You don't need to go through a curtain into a tabernacle or a temple. Jesus has opened up the new and living way. That's why the curtain tore in two. We don't need that anymore. You now have access to God. This same God who came and filled the temple and the tabernacle with his glory, you can now enter his presence. You can go to be with him also. That's where Christ is. This is Eden restored. This is that perfection coming back. You can be in the presence of God in Christ, not excluded by your sin anymore, but welcomed by God. You reject the Son, you will receive the condemnation of God. You turn to the Son, you will be received, welcomed through this new and living way, and you will have entrance into the presence of God, even as you pray. So, out with the old. Out with the old. You might be wondering now why all of this stuff matters. Well, the thing is, these judgments of God were absolutely awful. The flattening of the temple in Ezekiel's day, and indeed in Jesus' day, or soon after Jesus' day. They serve as warning that your judgment is coming. How awful those judgments were is a picture of the awful judgment that is coming to you. They rejected God. They rejected his son, Jesus. And then God rejected them and brought judgment and condemnation. But it doesn't have to be that way for you. Jesus entered the world specifically to go to the cross to open up that new and living way for you to come to God. Your sin, your offence cuts you off from him. Most of humanity are excluded from his presence. But the way to God has been opened up through Jesus Christ. He has gone. He is there now. Not through a kind of man-made curtain, but he is in glory now. No high priest going through this curtain once a year. Jesus has gone through once for all. And he lives, and he calls you now to repent, to turn from your sin, to turn to him for forgiveness. That's what he calls you to do. That's what he delights for anyone to do. But there is a warning here for the church. As individuals, we have great joy. We out with the old. You turn from your sin. You're a new creation. You call on God for forgiveness. And it's in with the new. You live to him. You live for him. You live with him as your Lord forever. And that is the highest blessing. He will bring you to be with his Father in glory forever. But as a church, both locally and generally in this country and across the West, we need to take heed of some of these warnings still. Because when Ezekiel spoke against Israel, he made the point that what Israel was supposed to do was be completely different from the nations around. They were to be holy. They were to be God's people. But in fact, they became the same as the nations around, if not worse than the nations around. They were supposed to make God known, but they'd become indistinguishable from the nations around them. Our own society must be obnoxious to God in so many ways. There is so much that our society calls good that he calls evil. There's so much that he calls good that our society calls evil. Our society is collapsing in on itself. We felt the divisions, obviously, of Brexit, and they will continue to affect us in all sorts of ways. We've seen the shock of what America's been up to in the last few days. The Prime Minister of New Zealand has done beautifully in dealing with leadership in so many ways, and yet New Zealand have just passed some of the most shocking laws on abortion anywhere in the world. Abortion and euthanasia laws will continue to chip away at the value of life made in God's image in our own country and across the world. We must, as a society, be really obnoxious to him. There's sin all around us. The church must be distinctive. We must be holy. Each of us and all of us must live holy lives as God defines holiness. And in saying that, we don't stand in condemnation of the world. That's not our role at all. But as Christ's kingdom of priests, we're to intercede for the world around us. We're to pray for them. That's why the prayer meeting is so important. We're to pray for the world around us. We're to live holy lives and to make God's way known, to call out, in doing that, you call out sin in others as they see his holiness in you. We're to make God's way seen to be good, living life to the full, with a profound peace and joy that comes from being in the presence of God. Our world needs that, doesn't it? I believed in God, so I spoke. I spoke to him about this world. I spoke of him to this world. So, God has demonstrated both patience and punishment against those who rejected the Son. The patience runs out and the punishment, the judgment comes in the end. Is God blessing our society? Is God blessing the world that we're in? No. Is God blessing you in that? Are you part of that? Do we not need to repent, to turn from our sin, to cry out to God for salvation? As you do that, you will receive it. Look at the lengths he's gone to give you this new and living way of access to him. You can simply turn and pray to him now. Jesus warned his disciples to flee from the judgment that was coming to Jerusalem. He calls you to flee from the judgment that is coming to you, but you flee to Jesus. He is your refuge, and he will receive you. We're going to sing our final hymn, which is a beautiful hymn that points us to the cross and what Jesus was doing there. Here is love, vast as the ocean.